This is the 18th session of our Accademia Bessarion, and it follows on Professor Thomas Hill's discussion of Vassar College and the Cupid and Psyche tapestries in their library. He is their art librarian and a professor also of English, a medievalist like myself, and I was very grateful for that talk. And today we are talking a bit more about the Cupid and Psyche story. And there we are. Lucius Apuleius, who wrote the Metamorphoses or the Golden Ass, began it by saying, "In this Milesian tale, I shall string together diverse stories and delight your kindly ears with a pleasant history, if you will not scorn to look upon this Egyptian paper written with a sharpened pen of Nile reeds. Ad ego tibi semone isto milesio varias fabulas conseram, auresque tuas benevolas, lepido susuro, permuciam modo si papyrum Egyptiam agutis, nilotici calami inscriptam." I get my Latin confused between the classical Latin I was taught in my Anglican convent school and ecclesiastical medieval Latin, which is much more like Italian pronunciation. So I will muddle them up as I read these. But this is the scene painted by John Weldon Spencer Stanhope of Psyche with Charon, and this will be elucidated more fully later on in this course, in this discourse. And also we see, let's see if I can get to the next one. What we needed to do was to be doing this there better. And we presented with the Museo Archeologico Nazionale, the National Archaeological Museum here in Florence, which had the spoils of Champollion and Rossellini's expedition to Egypt and Nubia. We did the discussion in the cemetery of its Egyptian motifs influenced by Champollion's book. And I read with an actress. She did the Italian and I did the English of Apuleius and Elizabeth Barrett Browning's translations of his prose into poetry. And we clothed our actress as is Psyche in John Rodham Spencer Stanhope's painting, which is now owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Plus, we also have the works of Frederick Lord Leighton. He was very young, studying here in Florence, very precocious, very handsome, but never married. He was studying art at the Accademia di Belle Arti, and then became president of the Royal Society. This is his self-portrait in the Uffizi. And at 25, he painted this massive canvas of the carrying of Cimabue's Madonna from his studio in Borgo Alegre to the joy and delight of the crowds to Santa Maria Novella from the story in Vasari. And he's actually painting what Elizabeth Barrett Browning had already written about in her Casa Guidi Windows. She was a good reader of Vasari. Anna Jameson was her friend, the great iconographer of Florentine art. And then Leighton illustrated Romola, George Eliot's novel. And this is this wonderful scene where Romola has discovered that Tito, her Greek husband, is two-timing her and has another wife with a baby in a cradle. She is livid with rage. And then he also, for Elizabeth Barrett Browning, at the end of her life, she wrote the poem Musical Instrument. She'd always loved the figure of Pan and identified Robert as Pan. That is also true in Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel of The Marble Faun, that is modeled on Robert. And here though Elizabeth is talking about how her marriage has gone sour. Her husband is killing her. He's profiting from her poetry, doesn't allow her the money, even to help the family slave who had paid for the publication of her essay on mind. Robert's friend has bilked her out of all of her savings and she's gone mad. And so it's a tragic story. And Leighton, whose sister was to write Robert Browning's official biography, knows about it. Here's this wonderful painting, Flaming June, and which Andrew Lloyd Webber wanted to buy. It was available for £100, but his grandmother said no, wouldn't advance the sum. And here is his painting of Psyche in Cupid's palace. It's a lovely painting, quite un-Victorian, but very academic. Psyche was a most beautiful young girl with two older jealous sisters. Everyone admired her, but no one married her, until her father took her up on a hill to be married to a god or a monster. While Psyche wept upon the rock forsaken, alone, despairing, dreading, gradually by Zephyrus she was enwrapped and taken, still trembling like the lilies planted high. Through all her fair white limbs, her vesture spread, her very bosom eddying with surprise. He drew her slowly from the mountain head and bore her down the valleys with wet eyes, and laid her in the lap of a green dell, as soft with grass and flowers as any nest, with trees beside her and a limpid well. Yet love was not far off from all that rest, is how Elizabeth translated Sicen autem paventem ac trapitam, et in ipso scopuli vertice deflentem mitis aura mollite, spirantis zephyri, vibratis hind inde iacinis, et flatus sinu, sensim levatam suo tranquillo spiritu, vehens palatim per dex vexa, rupis excelse, vallis subdite florentis, cespitis gremio de lapsam reclinat. And the gem, it's fake. It was the Ashmolean Museum got tricked into buying these gems, which were made in the 19th century. They weren't the original Roman gems, but they illustrate the story of Cupid and Psyche most interestingly. They were bought from the Count Poniatowski, who was actually here in Florence. And here Psyche comes to a palace where every night someone unseen comes to her. Lord Leighton, who designed Elizabeth Browning's tomb, painted this scene of Psyche taking her bath in this wonderful magical villa. Her sisters visit and tell her to murder this monster during his sleep. She prepares to do so. Then Psyche, weak in body and soul, put on the cruelty of fate in place of strength. Tunc Psyche et corporis et animi alioquin infirma, fati tamen se vitia subministrante viribus roboratu, et prolata lucerna et arepta novacula sexum audacia mutatur. She raised the lamp to see what should be done, and seized the steel, and was a man at length, encouraged though a woman. Yes, but when the light fell on the bed whereby she stood to view the beast that lay there, certes then she saw the gentlest, sweetest beast in wood, even Cupid's self, the beauteous god, more beauteous for that sweet sleep across his eyelids dim. The light the lady carried as she viewed did blush for pleasure as it lighted him. The dagger trembled from its aim unduteous, and she, oh she, amazed and soul distraught, and fainting in her whiteness like a veil, slid down upon her knees, and shuddering thought to hide, though in her heart the dagger pale. She would have done it, but her hands did fail to hold the guilty steel. They shivered so, and feeble, exhausted, unawares she took to gazing on the god, till look by look her eyes with larger life did fill and glow. And the Latin, Cupidinem formosum Deum formose cubantem, sacrilegi novaculam penitatebat, ad vero sice tanto aspectu deterita et imposanimi, macido pallore defecta tremensque desedit in imos poplites, et verum querit abscondere, sed in suo pectore, quod profecto fecisset nisi ferum timore, tanti flagiti manibus temerariis de lapsum evolasset, iamque lassa salute defecta dum sapius divini vultus intuetur pulcritudinem recreatur animi. She stands gazing on him, next tries to play with her husband's quiver full of arrows, being pricked on the thumb. Be these my husband's arms? And straightway raised an arrow from the quiver case, and tried its point against her finger, trembling still. She pushed it in too deeply, foolish bride, and made her blood some dewdrops small distil, and learnt to love of her own goodwill. Quaedum insatiabili, animo sique satis et curiosa, rimato atque petrectat, et mariti sui mirato arma de promit unam, de faretra sagitam, et puncto pollicis extremam aciem, periclita bunda trementis etiam nunc articuli nisu fortiore pupugit, alius ut per sumam cutem roraveverint pavulae sanguinis rosae gutae, sic ignara sice sponte in amoris incidit amorem. Next, gazing upon her beloved, holding the lamp, she lets drop a drop of burning oil upon his shoulder. He awakes and flees. She, hopelessly forlorn, goes seeking Cupid. She tries to drown herself in the river, which casts her back up again. The gentle river, in her Cupid's honour, because he used to warm the very wave, did ripple aside instead of closing on her, and cast up Psyche with the refluence brave upon the flowery bank, all sad and sinning. Then Pan, the rural god, by chance was leaning along the brow of waters as they wound, kissing the reed nymph till she sank to ground, and teaching without knowledge of the meaning to run her voice in music after his, down many a shifting note. And as the hoary god beheld her there, the poor, worn, fainting Psyche, knowing all the grief she suffered, he did gently call her name and softly comfort her despair. And here Elizabeth is writing this translation, which Robert will publish after her death, during perhaps their courtship, when Robert is bringing her out of her deep depression and illness, and giving her the romance of marriage to a fellow poet and the elopement out of disobedience to her father to Italy. And I can't read all of the Latin because the bar with the information is covering some of it. But let's give the ending part of it. Complexus eco montanem deam iamque voculas omnimodas educens recinere proxime ripam vago pastu lasciviunt comam fluvi tondentes capelle. Hircuosus Deus sauciam sicen, atque defectam utcumque casus eius non inscius, clemente ad se vocatam, sic pemulcet verbis leninetibus. He's wonderful the way he handles the Latin. And it's not his own language. He's from Africa, which we tend to forget. These great African writers or part of the Roman Empire, like Apuleius, Augustine, and Terence. And here is the engraving by Lord Leighton of the god Pan, which he partly takes from a sculpture in the Torrigiani Garden here in Florence, a sculpture from the 17th century, where the face is broken, so it's very grotesque. And he actually places this on Elizabeth Barrett Browning's tomb in the two faces on the harp, symbolizing Greek literature, which you see as you go up the path first. In Psyche's anger with her sisters, she tells them to go to the same hilltop and cast themselves down as she had. But they are not protected by Zephyrus. Instead, they are dashed against the rocks. She comes to Ceres' temple seeking sanctuary there and sorts out all the sacred sheaves and harvesting scythes. But Ceres has to obey Venus. This is her speech to Ceres seeking sanctuary. Now by thy right hands gathering from the shocks of golden corn, and by thy gladsome rites of harvest and thy consecrated sites, shut safe and mute in chests, and by the course of thy slave dragons, and the driving force of ploughs along Sicilian glebes profound, by thy swift chariot, and by thy steadfast ground, by all those nuptial torches that departed with thy lost daughter, and by those that shone back with her when she came again glad-hearted, and by all the other mysteries which are done in silence at Eleusis, I beseech thee, O Ceres, take some pity and abstain from giving to my soul extreme pain, who am the wretched Psyche. Let me teach thee a little mercy, and have thy leave to spend a few days only in thy garnered corn, until that wrathful goddess at the end shall feel her hate grow mild. And then we'll read a bit of the Latin. Ad luminosarum filiae inventionum remiacula etc. que silentio tegit elevsinis atticae sacrarum miserandae sices animae supplicis tuae subsiste inter istam spicarum congeriem pot patere vel pauculos dies delitescan, quoa Dei tantae serviens irae spatio temporis mitigator, vel certe meae vires diutino, labore fessae quietis intervalla leniantur. Here we have again the sense of Venus's great anger, this jealousy of one woman towards another. She then goes to Venus, who sets her impossible tasks. The last to bring back from Proserpina, Persephone, and Hades a jar with beauty inside it. And Thomas Hill explained that these jars in Roman culture were so important. They were jars of cosmetics to make women beautiful. She is advised on her despairing journey to go down to Hades with 2 coins in her mouth and 2 cakes in her hand, the coins with which to pay Charon, the cakes with which to appease Cerberus. Elizabeth does not translate this scene into her English verse, but another paints it, John Rodham Spencer Stanhope. For next to Elizabeth Barrett Browning's tomb is that sculpted by John Rodham Spencer Stanhope for his dead daughter Mary, whom he painted as Psyche going down to Hades, meeting Charon. Mary was only 7 when she died, and he's imagining her as having lived to 17. Next, she encounters Cerberus, and we remember that both Charon and Cerberus are in Virgil's Aeneid and Dante's Inferno. And here we see a feminized version of the story. A mighty dog with 3 colossal necks and heads in grand proportion, vast as fear, with jaws that bark the thunder out that breaks, in most innocuous dread for ghosts are near, who are safe in death from sorrow. He reclines across the threshold of Queen Proserpine's dark sweeping halls, and there for Pluto's spouse doth guard the entrance of the empty house. When Psyche threw the cake to him once amain, he howled up wildly from his hunger pain, and was still after. Canis namque pregrandis teriugo et satis amplo capite preditus, immanis et formidabilis tonantibus oblatrans falcibus mortuos, quibus iam nil mali potes facere, frustra teridando ante ipsum limen et atria Proserpine, semper excubans servat vacuam ditis domum, hunc offrenatum unius ovula preda introibus. Having fulfilled all Venus's tasks, Psyche is now able to claim Cupid as her husband. But this tale is the ancestor of the Risorgimento I Promessi Sposi, where the husband and wife can never come together for ages and ages in this 3-decker Victorian novel, just as much as the Golden Ass is the ancestor of Carlotti's Pinocchio, changing into a donkey. Their wedding feast, though Psyche is mortal, is held on Mount Olympus, and Jove's right hand approached the ambrosial ball to Psyche's lips, that scarce dared yet to smile. Drink, O my daughter, and acquaint thy soul with deathless uses, and be glad the while. No more shall Cupid leave thy lovely side. Thy marriage joy begins for never ending. While yet he spake, the nuptial feast supplied. The bridegroom on the festive couch was bending o'er Psyche in his bosom. Porrecto ambrosiae poculo sume inquit, Psyche, et immortalis esto, nec unquam degredietur atur nexu Cupido, sed iste vobis erunt perpetue nuptue. It's a lovely scene, which is in the tapestries at Vasa. Jove the same on Juno, and the other deities alike range round. The rural cup boy came, and he's the one who's snatched up by the eagle to be Jove's cupbearer, and poured Jove's nectar out with shining eyes, while Bacchus for the others did as much, and Vulcan spread the meal, and all the hours made all things purple, with a sprinkle of flowers, of roses chiefly, not to say the touch of their sweet fingers, and the graces glided their balm around, and the muses through the air struck out clear voices, which were still divided by that diviner's song, Apollo there intoned to his lute, while Aphrodite fair did float her beauty along the tune and play the notes right with her feet, and thus the day through every perfect mood of joy was carried. The muses sang their chorus, Satyrus did blow his pipes, Pan touched his reed, and thus at last were Cupid and his Psyche married. Muse quoque canora personabant, Apollo cantavid ad Cytheram, Venus suavi musicae cinata, ut muse quidem corum canerent, et tibias inflarent, Satyrus et paniscus ad fistulam dicerent, sic rite, sice convenit in manum Cupidinis, et nascitur illis maturo patu filia, quam voluptatum nominamus, and their daughter is born, who is named Joy. And this is the wonderful sculpture at Canova of Cupid and Psyche. But this is the one that Elizabeth Barrett Browning most loves. It's a Roman sculpture of Cupid and Psyche that's in the Uffizi. And she imagines it is actually in her room in Casa Guidi, which in Aurora Lee she describes as being not in opposite the Pitti Palace, but up on the hill of Bellosguardo, looking down on Florence as if it were the apocalypse, for the scene in which Aurora and Romney Lee come together again. He is now blind, no longer able to control her, whereas she had run from him because he's too controlling of her. When I taught, I always saw that at least one text in my required reading list that the students bought was in parallel text in Latin as well as English or in French or whatever. And in this case, I would assign them the Loeb Classics, Apuleius Golden Ass, with its lovely translation by an Elizabethan William Ardlington. And here you see the Latin and the English on the other side. And then one evening, I was director of medieval studies at Colorado. And with my senior professors of medieval studies in the different departments, we would meet every month in John Hoag's faculty apartment. He was an old retired from the Secret Service and was a wonderful art historian who would travel in Spain from monastery to monastery. He described going to convents where the nuns had spikes that came out at whoever was at the grill, and he would be trying to read a manuscript and the nun would be warning him not to poke his eyes out with these spikes. John Hoag was a wonderful person for keeping us all together. And one night we started talking about Apuleius, and probably he was Freemason, because Apuleius' novel is both the Greek mythology, the Roman mythology of Juno, Jove, and so on and so forth. But it ends with the Egyptian mythology of Isis and Osiris, and the need to put the pieces together and missing one important part. So at any rate, in one evening, we dreamed up this conference on Apuleius, and we invited Gertrude Drake, who was in a wheelchair with diabetes, and ordering martinis and chocolate mousse for breakfast. And John Hoag and Peter Nerd and myself, Oliver Ellsworth, Stella Rivard, who is married to a Native American. And we put together these talks, but also with them, we had Leslie Marmon Silko telling this wonderful Navajo story on the mesas, where the mother's daughter has died from a snake bite. And she takes all of the clothes of the daughter as she's mourning her and throws them off the cliffside. and they all turn into butterflies. And Psyche's name means both soul and butterfly. And then Rose Cordova was penitente from Denver, and she told the story of Henry Cornfield with the puppet beside her, who imaged her and had the sort of pilgrim hat. And Henry Cornfield is Spanish, and he wants to marry the white man's daughter. And the white man says, no, you can't. And because you're wheat colored, not white. And so Henry Cornfield in his mourning becomes a scarecrow, but the daughter comes to him, and the jewels on his scarecrow's clothing save her from poverty. And it's a terrifying story about the oppression that is done through discrimination. And then there's Rose Lloyd. Gypsy, was abandoned as a baby. Her mother took her to the poorhouse. She was too poor to continue supporting her. The father was alcoholic, and her only memory of him is of him coming drunk home and breaking the windows, and his horses with their brass on the harnesses and the great wagon. And she was brought up in this orphanage in London. And one day a voice called from the fence saying, Rose, Rose, I'm your brother. They were both put into the orphanage. She didn't know about her family. And it meant so much to her that she had at least this brother. But then he was sent off to Canada, and so they maintained contact, but he was very bitter about his being raised in an orphanage. She went into service and wrote wonderfully about what it was like, the mistress who had not paid her bills at Harrods, not being allowed to buy any more things, and so on. And I published her story. I tried to get it published by Virago, but Virago wrote back saying a woman of that class couldn't possibly write that well. Well, she did, because the orphanage school was actually very good. And the Royal Astronomer came and gave them books. She was given the copy of Lorna Doone. And then I think it's important to talk about Bruno Bettelheim, the uses of enchantment. Allegory. I'm not sure that fairy stories are really allegories. Allegory means what is outside of the forum, the marketplace, the law court. Because in the Greek world, you would hire a logographer to give you a true seeming speech to get you out of being condemned as a murderer. No, you were in somebody else's house committing adultery. You have witnesses to prove it, and so on and so forth. That is the law writing. And then the other writing, which is away from the law courts, is allegory and allegory. But fairy stories instead tend to fractal. This is Diamanta Roma, who is telling oral stories that I record. And these are her heritage from there 1,000 years ago from India. Her language is Sanskrit with Turkish and Persian additions. And in this story she's telling here, it's about the king with 3 daughters, and the king asks them who loves him most. And one says, I love you as much as sugar. And the other says, I love you as much as jewels. And the third says, I love you as much as salt. The king is furious and throws her out. But she's the one who looks after him in his old age. And this is Shakespeare's King Lear. And the stories, they're the wonderful stories, cocks and hens and foxes. And it's a rich library, but it hasn't been able to be written down because of slavery and discrimination. So that is our task now. And let's see. I have been finding these patterns of discrimination with African American students at Berkeley and Quincy. Suddenly, our tuition was raised by Reagan to keep them out. At Quincy, I was finding poor Black Catholic students from Chicago. The father had committed suicide. There were so many children because they were Catholic. And Yuri was just desperately wanting to continue to stay in college, but the family was too poor to go on paying. I felt dreadful about this. I was a Black students advisor. And then at Princeton, I had Native American and Italian students who came from poor backgrounds. I had this wonderful student, Hopi, who had been chosen to inherit all the Hopi law when he was just a toddler. And he wrote his midterm and gave himself a D. And I said, Victor, I don't believe that's the right grade. I'll tell you what, if you write not only all the answers that I ask on the final, but also give me Hopi analogues to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, it will be an A+. And it was a wonderful final exam he gave me. And I'm still in touch with him. And then at Boulder, it was Hispanic penitentiary students. And the tragedy there was to keep them out 10 years before I became their advisor. They had car bombed 2 carloads of Hispanic students, and they were all killed. And so they came back 10 years later. They hadn't dared come earlier than that because of their fear of being assassinated again. And when I left, and they gave me the sort of redundancy pay, I gave 10,000 of 36,000 for scholarships for the Hispanic students and 1,000 for the deaf students. They had asked us to go into a room with these machines that turned down the lights, and it had broken our hearing aids, and he needed to get his hearing aids repaired. And then at Holmhurst St. Mary, my convent school, there were Indian and African students. And now I have my own Roma students in Florence. And I feel that these stories are liberation stories. And the stories they tell themselves are stories of consolation and also stories about how to behave. Diamanta's stories are like Venus's tasks set to Psyche, impossible tasks. But the young girl is able to fulfill them because she's been kind to the animals and they come to her aid. Whereas the cruel sisters are not helped and don't win out and so on. And I find with the Roma, if you're kind to them, they reciprocate because this is their education. But if they see people cruel to them, then they're fair game. It'll be all right to steal from them, etc. And I think we need to learn that Bruno Bettelheim, in his the uses of enchantment, was saying it was tragic that the psychologists were forbidding fairy stories for children because there's so much encoding about social behavior, the correct ways and the incorrect ways that are taught by them. And really, we need to work for justice. La legge è uguale per tutti is placed in every courtroom in Italy, but it's not true. I've been fighting to save Diamanta's 4 children for her, and we haven't succeeded. And they were placed in an orphanage here in Florence, in the Villa Pozzino, with frescoes of the story of Cupid and Psyche. And if we remember, the story of Cupid and Psyche ends happily, but it's embedded in the tragedy of the two lovers to whom it's told as a consolation story by the old woman who is cooking the meal for the robbers. And the robbers then kill them and eat the meal. So we have these patterns of justice and injustice. And I find myself trying to explain this in books, as had Elizabeth Barrett Browning, as had Apuleius. Of writing many books, there is no end, is a fractaling of Ecclesiastes, our book on In God's Image, Neuroscience and Theology, this balancing of justice and mercy. And here we see more fractals. And then these are the two websites, one on Apuleius and the other on the Egyptian aspects in our cemetery. That was both of these born of the museum exhibition and visit to the cemetery by the Museo Archeologico. And I want to thank Thomas Hill very much for Cupid and Psyche and his presentation, of which this is an appendix. Okay, now we can interrupt the condivisione and we can also end the slideshow. Termina.